history cannot be boring because history is literally the world, the whole world. A lot of professors straight up advised me not to pursue a PhD in Korean history. They were like, you're gonna suffer for a lot of years. At that time, I went to Seoul National University for a year. The history programs in the West are pretty Eurocentric. Wikipedia knows all the facts. The internet knows all the facts. Why do we need historians then? We are in Korea, in Cheonan, and I'm in this park that I really like. The topic that I would like to talk about is my love for history and how did I go from being a random little guy in Canada to having a master's in Korean history. Previous video, I explained how I got into contact with Korea for the first time, and it was through K-pop, and more specifically through Girls' Generation. I'm not gonna talk about that specifically since I already talked about it, but I'm gonna dive more into why Korean history. So I'm ethnically Lebanese, and my parents are from Lebanon. Today, Lebanon is on the news almost every day. Just before these events, I think most people in Korea did not know what Lebanon is or where it is or what type of people live there. So I come from a Arabic Muslim background, but I was born and raised in Canada. It was just to give you like a quick idea of who I am. So let's get back to history. I've always loved history since as far as I can remember. In the beginning, my interest was really focused on Greek mythology and history and all of this antiquity period in Europe with Rome, etc. Mythology has always been interesting to me because they have a story for most of the natural phenomenon and to explain the world around them, which I really found fascinating. That was coupled with my love for learning more about the early history of Islam. When I was a teen, I really got interested into the history of Islam. That was when I considered myself Muslim and pious. And by studying this history of Islam, you realized how much all of it is really political. Of course, there is a religious basis when we look at the Prophet Muhammad and its interaction with God. Except from this, the whole Islamic experience or history is pretty political. It became a global empire, maybe one of the biggest in the world, maybe just after the Mongol Empire. So yes, when I was in high school, I was really interested in history, as I said. And then before starting university, I came to Korea. And I already told you the story in the other video, so you can go and watch this if you want. But I got interested into Korea through K-pop, and also Korean culture made me want to come to Seoul. Yeah, I was working in a restaurant and living that more carefree life, let's say, in that first year in Korea. After that, I started wanting to go back and study something in Canada. I decided to study history in university. The program was simply history, so it's world history, but most of the classes are related to Europe and America in general, right? The history programs in the West are pretty Eurocentric, which is quite understandable because I imagine that in Korea you'd learn more about Asia. What I decided to do while studying history at the university in Montreal for my bachelor's, I wanted to focus on Korea. So as soon as I got the chance of choosing some of the classes, I chose to specialize in Korea. I remember that at that time we had to do a project for the Cold War, and I decided to focus on the Korean War, and I talked a lot about the North Korean experience and the destruction that happened in North Korea. Most of the other students were pretty interested to have this perspective. Of course, I also discussed the massacres that happened in South Korea, some of them by the American Army, by the way. I was also taking classes of the master's level during my bachelor because it was a special program, an honor program, and I had an academic supervisor that was the main professor in terms of Chinese history, and he asked me to do a final project, and I chose to do it on the Samgang Heng Shildo. It was basically like a guide, a Confucian guide, to learn about the three main values of Confucianism, and those stories always had also an image with them. So they were maybe the first comics of Korea. There were stories like a daughter fighting a tiger to save her father. Stories that really exemplify the perfect values of Korean society. At that time, I went to Seoul National University for a year in the Asian History department. And I had a lot of classes about Korean history and Asian history, and I really learned a lot in the Seoul National University, more than I intended to. I learned about the Samguk Shide, I learned about more modern Korean history, the Gwangju Uprising, a ton of things about Korean history. I really started to understand Korean history as a whole. So then I decided that it was time for me to do my master's. At that time, I had the ambition of becoming a professor in Korean history. I wanted to finish my PhD and eventually start to teach, because that's really what I was passionate about, and I'm still passionate about. But you'll see why I stopped, or at least took a break. So at that time, I was already married. I was married with my wife from Korea, and we wanted to start living together in Canada. I had explored the idea of doing my master's in the United States, but the grades were there, but the money wasn't there, and it was way too expensive, especially for a master's. For a PhD, it is possible to go there because they give scholarships and funding to help you study, but for masters, it is much more difficult. So I decided to seek out the best university possible in Canada that could teach me about Korean history, and that was in Vancouver, the University of British Columbia. So I applied and I got in. I'm not going to talk too much about all the details related to my academic advisors. You know how it can be for a lot of people in that field, or in general when you study university. Sometimes the relationship is pretty contentious. But I had two academic advisors from the beginning. One of them was an American who studied Korean history for almost all of his life. And another one was Korean. The Korean professor specialized on Joseon's relationship with the rest of Asia, or its international relations. Eventually, my main advisor became Dr. Ross King. Hi, Dr. Ross King, if you're listening to this. He's a specialist, a linguist, and a real specialist of the Middle Korean, which was the Korean language spoken around the early Joseon period, let's say. I also eventually got a lot of help from very renowned historians of China that worked in the University of British Columbia, and they helped me for the aspect that dealt with China within my project, my master's project. They sat on the advisory committee that judged my master thesis. Not wanting to bore you too much with the detail, but my master thesis, which is a very important part of my life, and I spent almost 2 years working on it. So it was about local social contracts called the community compacts, or in Korean, hyangyak. Basically, they are contracts. Inhabitants of a village come together and they establish certain Confucian rules to respect, and also what to do and how to help each other in times of need, and a ton of other specifications to help the management of the village. This was really interesting to me because they were the tools that the aristocrats, the Yangban, used to have a better control over the villages on which they basically ruled. Why didn't I continue after my master's to the PhD? That's the question, right? Well, I had a lot of interesting conversations with a lot of professors and students, PhD students, master students at that time. I went to a lot of conferences, a lot of workshops, and I could meet people who were interested in Korean history from all over the world. The portrait was kind of bleak. The opportunities were kind of blurry. And even a lot of professors straight up advised me not to pursue a PhD in Korean history. They were like, you're gonna suffer for a lot of years before you can find a work that satisfies you. Even without their advice, I could see that a PhD in the West, in Canada or the United States, was 6 years. 5 years at the very, very minimum. The postdoc would last a year or two. After that, you might be hired as an assistant professor or as a lecturer. You might work that for another 3 years before you were given an opportunity to become an associate professor. And by the time you became a full professor that had a decent salary, you were basically, 55 years old or 50 years old? I'm maybe exaggerating a little bit, but that's basically the picture here. I love history, don't get me wrong, I love history. But I also like having resources to feed my family and to live happily. A lot of them told me that because of the strain of those constant studies, they had to divorce. A lot of divorce cases. So I was like, no, I like my wife, and and I want to live happily for the next 10 years. So, gujiwe? Why do I have to force myself into this PhD program? So I thought there must be other ways for me to work in relation to history without having to go through all this. Of course, I really loved teaching. I did a lot of tutoring online and in person. I worked as a tutor for many years. But eventually, I went back to Montreal and I got hired in the government. Honestly, the government is as good as any other place for a graduate of history, right? There's a lot of people who studied history that end up working in the government. And I think that applies for most countries. But the first opportunity that I got in the Quebec government in Canada was in the immigration. So I worked as an immigration officer for a while. And then eventually I got the opportunity to work for the Ministry of International Relations as the person responsible at that time for India and some other countries in Asia. And then later, while working in that department, I was transferred to Korea. I was really happy. It was a really great job. I got to meet a lot of people, and there were so many different opportunities to work with different aspects of the relationship that can exist between Quebec and South Korea, whether it's culture, trade, or education. So then why am I holding a camera now and doing YouTube videos in South Korea? That's the right question. That's the real question here. Almost, a few months ago, I decided to quit that job and come to South Korea to finally do kind of what I've always wanted. Over all these past years, I've had two passions: K-pop and Korean history. For those who watched the other video, you would know that I tried to be a K-pop star at some point, or at least I did some auditions in the hopes of being implicated in the K-pop industry. I actually never got so close to get implicated in the K-pop industry as now. Having become a content creator here in Korea, I met a lot of people who are also in this field. So I met people who were already on TV. Even me, myself, I was able to go to the radio a couple of times and talk about me and my projects. So this aspect is kind of progressing. And the reason that I came back here is that even though I had a job that was dealing with South Korea and its culture, I still wanted to discuss history, Korean history and the world history. So yeah, I decided to come to Korea and to become a YouTuber, or at least a content creator. I'm also doing Instagram, a little bit of TikTok, but I'm still learning. A lot. There's a lot to learn. So if you haven't subscribed yet, please subscribe to my channel, because I'm trying so many different formats and I'm trying so many different things in trying to bring this interesting historical content in a fun way. Most times I think that I need a very elaborate video and a lot of editing and stuff, and then I keep remembering that just opening the camera and talking to you guys is maybe the most efficient and interesting way for us to connect. So if you look at the first video of this channel when I first started, you'll see what type of content I was doing. It's a pretty heavy video, a lot of information. I compared the Statue of Liberty with the Sokuram Bunjeonbul in Gyeongju here in South Korea, which is another religious statue. In any case, that video got only like 200 views, so I realized that okay, that's not the way to go. I can't spend months and months preparing a video only for it to get a few hundred views. And maybe the format that I used was a bit old school, maybe a little bit. So I'm learning more now about social media marketing, how to present your ideas, how to package everything to make it look attractive. If people don't click, people will not watch, obviously. How do you present your story? How do you attract people? That's what I'm focusing on these days. So one question remains for this video is, what do I intend to do in the future? What are my future plans in relation to history? I thought to myself that I don't necessarily have to go through university and the academic system in order to discuss history. There are a lot of people who talk about history, who discuss very interesting things through their own means, and social media is a perfect way to do that. To use social media to propagate my ideas about history and eventually write books, why not? And at the same time, I'm trying to work my network here in South Korea. If I could become kind of a known person in relation to Korean history and to history, in South Korea, that would have been, I would have accomplished my goal. A lot of people think that history is just about dates and events and historical figures, but that's not at all how I view history. History is an all-encompassing subject. It is literally everything that happened in the past. And that includes politics, that includes science, that includes sports, that includes everything. So history cannot be boring because history is literally the world, the whole world. So if you care about anything in this world, then you care about history. Let me give you an example. When a lawyer is confronted with a new problem that he's not used to dealing with, he looks at jurisprudence, meaning the past rulings of judges that existed before his time. That way he can understand, okay, in the past they dealt with the situation like this and like that. So you understand my point here is that I don't want to discuss dates and events. What I intend to do is to really demystify history. There is not one institution today that just exists. There is not just one law that just exists. Everything has its historical context. Everything has its reasons. You know, a lot of times when I say, yeah, I have a master's in Joseon history, Koreans would react, oh, can you name all the kings? No one spends years and years studying this. Wikipedia knows all the facts. The internet knows all the facts. Why do we need historians then? What are we doing? We're putting pieces of the puzzle together. It is the product of my own work, of my own thoughts. History is just a story. If J.K. Rowling didn't think of Harry Potter and the whole universe of Harry Potter, you wouldn't have had that story. Same thing for history. You need people to reinvent, re-understand, put pieces together in history and make you see the world differently. I just intend to be a little part of this process. And I also understand that for a lot of people, talking directly about history is maybe not that interesting. So I also will discuss social issues, racism, the topic of female empowerment and female leaders. But it's not just historical topics, but also social topics and political topics that are really important these days. Of course, to be able to do everything that I just explained, I also need my Korean to be at the right level. So I do speak Korean, but I still need to practice more in order to discuss history and politics, etc. So I'm learning every day. I'm teaching myself every day. So one day I'll get there. So I might also do videos in Korean from time to time, and there are some of them already on my channel. So thank you for having watched this video, and please continue to support me if you like my project, and I'll see you in the next one.